Ma'am, who are you and what are you doing in this house?
This is my home. What seems to be the problem?
We got reports of suspicious activity. I need your ID.
On what legal basis?
Just cooperate, ma'am.
The morning coffee was still brewing when Judge Patricia Williams heard the commotion outside her front door. She was preparing for another day on the federal bench, reviewing the case file for a sentencing hearing scheduled for that afternoon. The heavy footsteps on her porch gave her pause. Then came the aggressive knock that would change everything. What happened next would destroy the careers of two police officers, send shockwaves through the justice system, and prove that not even those who wear the robe are immune to the ugliest forms of prejudice. The body camera footage from that Tuesday morning would accumulate over 25 million views, spark congressional hearings, and lead to the most severe penalties for racial profiling in the state's history. Judge Patricia Williams was no ordinary target. At 52 years old, she had served as a federal judge for the past decade, appointed by the president himself. Before that, she had spent 8 years as a district attorney, prosecuting some of the most complex criminal cases in the region. Her reputation was impeccable. Her record on the bench was respected by lawyers on both sides of the aisle, prosecution and defense alike. She lived a quiet life in an upscale neighborhood, drove a modest sedan, and was known to her neighbors as the woman who organized the annual block party and helped elderly residents with their groceries. That Tuesday morning began like any other. Judge Williams woke early, went for her usual jog through the tree-lined streets of her subdivision, and then returned home to get ready for work. She lived in a beautiful colonial-style house she had purchased 3 years prior. Complete with a manicured lawn and flower beds, she tended to herself on weekends. Nothing in her daily routine suggested a dramatic conflict was on the horizon. At exactly 7:23 a.m., Officer Daniel Reeves and Officer Marcus Thompson pulled into her driveway. They claimed they were responding to a suspicious person call. Someone had allegedly reported a black woman who didn't belong in the neighborhood, entering and exiting the house at odd hours. The problem was, no such call was ever made. Here's what really happened. Officer Reeves was on a routine patrol in the upscale neighborhood when he saw Judge Williams returning from her morning run. The sight of a successful black woman, dressed in workout clothes and clearly comfortable in the affluent area, somehow struck a nerve. He radioed his partner, Thompson, fabricated a lie about a suspicious person report, and requested backup. It was a decision that would become the most expensive mistake of both of their careers. Judge Williams opened the front door, still in her silk robe, coffee mug in hand. She expected to see a neighbor or perhaps a delivery person. Instead, she found herself facing two uniformed police officers, both with their hands on their belts in an aggressive posture. Officer Reeves immediately demanded to know who she was and what she was doing in the house. Confused but composed, Judge Williams asked if something was wrong. Reeves ignored her question and repeated his demand for identification. When she asked why they were at her door, Thompson stepped forward and said they had received a report of suspicious activity at this address. It was at this moment that Judge Williams made what would later prove to be a brilliant decision. Instead of immediately revealing her status as a federal judge, she decided to see just how these officers would treat someone they perceived to have no power or status. She calmly told them this was her home and asked what specific suspicious activity had been reported. The officers couldn't provide details because there was no actual report. Reeves stammered something about someone not belonging in the neighborhood. Thompson added that they needed to verify she was authorized to be there. When Judge Williams asked if they had a warrant or any legal authority to demand entry into her home, both officers became visibly agitated. Officer Reeves told her that her attitude was suspicious and that a cooperative citizen wouldn't ask so many questions. Thompson warned her that obstruction of an investigation could lead to arrest. Remaining calm but firm, Judge Williams stated that she was simply exercising her constitutional rights in her own home. That's when Officer Reeves made his second catastrophic error. He pushed past Judge Williams and entered her house without permission, claiming he needed to check for other occupants. Thompson followed him inside. Both officers were now illegally inside the private home of a federal judge. Judge Williams did not resist, but she made it clear that they were entering without her consent and without a warrant. She took out her cell phone and began to record. The moment the camera came out, Officer Reeves erupted. He demanded that she stop recording immediately. When she refused, he reached for her phone. What the officers didn't know was that Judge Williams had installed a high-end security system just 6 months prior. Every angle of her front porch, living room, and kitchen was being recorded in high-definition video and with crystal-clear audio. Every moment of their illegal entry, every violation of her rights, and every word they spoke was being captured and automatically uploaded to cloud storage. The footage would later show Officer Reeves snatching the phone from Judge Williams's hand and throwing it across the room. It would show Officer Thompson rummaging through her personal belongings without any legal basis. It would capture the image of them standing illegally in her living room, demanding she prove she lived there. But the most damning footage was yet to come. When Judge Williams demanded their badge numbers and the name of their supervisor, Officer Reeves completely lost control. The racist tirade he unleashed next would end his career and land him in prison. Instead of stopping his partner, Thompson joined in, making his own disgusting comments about how some people don't know their place. They told her that nice houses and expensive neighborhoods weren't for people like her. They said she was probably paying her mortgage with money from drug dealing or prostitution. The language they used was so vile and hateful that when the footage was eventually played in court, several jurors visibly recoiled. Judge Williams endured the verbal abuse for nearly 20 minutes, documenting everything while maintaining an incredible sense of calm. She never once raised her voice or responded with anger. She simply repeated her request for their badge numbers and supervisor's contact information. When the officers finally completed their illegal search and found nothing because there was nothing to find, they prepared to leave. But Officer Reeves wasn't finished. He told Judge Williams that if he saw her in the neighborhood again, she would be arrested for trespassing. He said he would contact the homeowner, whoever that was, and tell them a suspicious black woman was trying to break into their house. It was then that Judge Williams finally revealed her identity. She walked to her home office, retrieved her judicial credentials, and placed them on the coffee table in front of the two officers. The look on their faces when they realized they had just spent 20 minutes racially abusing a federal judge in her own home would become the stuff of legend in law enforcement training circles. Officer Reeves turned deathly pale. Officer Thompson started backing toward the door. Both men were suddenly at a complete loss for words. Judge Williams calmly informed them that everything they had just done was on video, that they had violated multiple federal laws, and that she would be filing complaints with every relevant authority before the day was over. Have you ever seen someone's entire world crumble in real time? If you've witnessed a moment like that, let me know in the comments. The officers practically fled her house, but the damage was done. 23 minutes of footage showing two police officers committing multiple felonies against a federal judge. The evidence was ironclad. The violations were clear, and the consequences would be swift and devastating. But Judge Williams was just getting started. Less than 30 minutes after the officers left her home, Judge Williams was on the phone with the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI). As a federal judge, she had a direct line to the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, and they took her call immediately. She gave them the initial account of what had happened and informed them she had full video evidence of multiple federal crimes. The FBI agent who took her call was Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran with extensive experience in police misconduct cases. Agent Santos had prosecuted dozens of civil rights violations, but she had never heard of anything like this. Two local cops had just committed federal crimes against a sitting federal judge in her own home, and it was all on video. Agent Santos was at Judge Williams's house within 2 hours, accompanied by a tech specialist and a civil rights prosecutor. They spent 4 hours reviewing the security footage, taking detailed statements, and documenting every aspect of the incident. The prosecutor, David Chain, shook his head continuously as he watched the videos. In his 15 years of prosecuting police misconduct, he had rarely seen evidence so clear or violations so egregious. Meanwhile, Officers Reeves and Thompson returned to their precinct in a panic. They knew they had made a catastrophic mistake, but they didn't realize just how catastrophic until they started researching who, exactly, Judge Patricia Williams was. What they found made their situation infinitely worse. Judge Williams wasn't just any federal judge. She was the chief judge of the federal district court, meaning she oversaw all federal criminal cases in the region. During her time on the bench, she had presided over hundreds of police misconduct cases. She had sentenced corrupt officers, approved search warrants, and ruled on constitutional violations. Her knowledge of federal law was encyclopedic, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for being absolutely relentless when it came to constitutional violations. Officer Reeves called in sick for the next week. Officer Thompson filed for emergency leave. Both men hired lawyers with money they didn't have, hoping desperately that they could somehow contain the damage. They couldn't. By Thursday morning, the story was national news. A federal judge had been racially profiled and illegally searched in her own home by local police. The video footage, released with Judge Williams's authorization, was playing on every major news network. Legal experts were calling it one of the clearest-cut cases of police misconduct ever recorded. Police Chief Robert Martinez held an emergency press conference that afternoon. He announced that both officers had been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. He called their actions inexcusable and promised that the department would cooperate fully with federal authorities. But to a public that had heard similar promises countless times before, his words rang hollow. What made this case different wasn't just the clear evidence or the high-profile victim. It was what happened next that sent a tremor through the world of law enforcement nationwide. The FBI didn't just investigate the incident. They launched a full-scale review of the entire police department's practices. They subpoenaed records from the past 5 years. They interviewed dozens of officers and civilians. They analyzed arrest patterns, complaint files, and internal communications. What they found was a pattern of racial profiling that went far beyond two bad apple cops. The data showed that black residents in affluent neighborhoods were stopped and questioned at 17 times the rate of their white counterparts. Internal emails showed supervisors joking about how certain types of people didn't belong in the nice parts of town. Training materials contained coded language that essentially taught officers to view successful black citizens as inherently suspicious. As it turned out, Officer Reeves had a history. He had received 12 complaints for racial profiling over the previous 3 years. All of them had either been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary action, like a verbal warning. One complaint came from a black neurosurgeon who was stopped while jogging in his own neighborhood. Another came from a couple who were questioned while loading groceries into their car outside their own home. Officer Thompson's record was just as disturbing, 9 complaints in 4 years, all following the same pattern. Both officers had been protected by a system that valued loyalty over accountability. And now, that system was about to be dismantled. A federal grand jury was convened within 3 weeks, the fastest in the district's history. 18 citizens listened to Judge Williams's testimony, reviewed the security footage, and heard from expert witnesses who explained exactly which federal laws had been broken. Deliberations lasted less than 4 hours. The indictment was devastating. Officer Reeves faced 7 federal charges, including deprivation of rights under color of law, unlawful search and seizure, criminal trespass, assault, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Each charge carried potential prison time, with the civil rights violation alone punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. Officer Thompson faced 6 similar charges. While he hadn't initiated the contact, his participation in the illegal search and his failure to stop his partner's obvious misconduct made him equally culpable under federal law. But the charges against the individual officers were just the beginning. The Department of Justice announced that the entire police department would be placed under federal oversight. A consent decree would govern their operations for the next 5 years, with every policy and procedure subject to federal approval. The cost of this oversight would run into the millions of dollars, all of it paid from the city's budget. The financial fallout was immediate. The city's insurance carrier canceled their police liability policy, citing the systemic issues proven by the federal investigation. Without insurance, the city faced potential bankruptcy if it lost a civil lawsuit. The mayor called an emergency budget meeting as legal fees began to mount. Meanwhile, Judge Williams returned to her courtroom, but she did not remain silent about what had happened to her. She used her position and platform to speak about the experience, giving interviews to major news outlets and testifying before a congressional committee on the need for police reform. Her message was simple and powerful. If this could happen to a federal judge in her own home, what was happening to ordinary citizens who didn't have her resources, her legal knowledge, or her ability to fight back? How many people had suffered similar violations but lacked the evidence or the platform to seek justice? The answer to that question would soon become clear as more victims, emboldened by the sight of a federal judge standing up, began to come forward. The floodgates were about to open, and the consequences would reach far beyond 2 disgraced police officers. Within days of the criminal indictment, the civil lawsuits began to be filed. Judge Williams hired the most aggressive civil rights attorney in the state, Rebecca Martinez, a woman who had built her career dismantling police departments that thought they were above the law. Martinez filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking $15 million in damages, and she had the evidence to get every penny. But Judge Williams wasn't the only one seeking justice. Once the story went national, her phone began ringing with calls from people who had suffered similar treatment at the hands of the same two officers. The law firm set up a hotline, and within 2 weeks, they had documented 43 separate incidents involving officers Reeves and Thompson. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating. A black pediatrician was handcuffed outside the hospital where she worked because Thompson claimed she looked suspicious walking to her car after a late shift. A successful businessman was forced to prove he owned his own Mercedes while pumping gas because Reeves insisted that someone like him couldn't afford such a car. A college professor was questioned for 20 minutes about whether she actually lived in her own neighborhood because the two officers happened to see her getting her mail. Every single incident followed the same pattern. Successful black citizens, going about their daily lives, targeted simply because of the color of their skin and the assumption that they didn't belong where they were. Most had filed complaints, but those complaints had disappeared into the department's internal system, never to be heard from again. Federal prosecutor David Chain realized he was dealing with more than just two rogue cops. This was a systemic pattern of civil rights abuses that had been ignored and enabled by department leadership. He expanded his investigation to include the supervisors who had dismissed clear-cut complaints and the administrators who had allowed the pattern to continue. Do you think this kind of behavior happens more often than we realize? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The trial of officers Reeves and Thompson began 6 months after the incident at Judge Williams's home. The courtroom was packed with media, civil rights activists, and community members who had been waiting years for accountability. The defendants sat at separate tables with their expensive lawyers, both looking like men who knew their lives were effectively over. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. They played the footage from Judge Williams's home security system, the crystal clear video, showing every moment of the illegal entry and search. They played the audio of the racist tirade and the threats. They presented evidence of the fabricated suspicious person report that was never actually made. Judge Williams testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She walked the jury through every moment of that morning, explaining how her constitutional rights had been violated and describing the fear she felt when armed officers invaded her home. She spoke of the humiliation of being told she didn't belong in her own neighborhood and the anger she felt hearing racist slurs in her own living room. Her testimony was calm, professional, and utterly devastating. Here was a federal judge, a person who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, describing how two officers had trampled on everything she stood for. The jury hung on her every word. The defense attorneys desperately tried to find an angle to save their clients. Reeves's lawyer argued that his client was following his training and reacting to what he genuinely believed was a suspicious situation. That argument fell apart when the prosecutor presented evidence that there had never been a suspicious person report and that Reeves had admitted to fabricating the reason for the initial contact. Thompson's lawyer tried to claim his client was just following his partner's lead and didn't fully comprehend the totality of what was happening. That defense collapsed when the prosecutor played the audio of Thompson actively participating in the racial abuse and the illegal search. The most damaging testimony came from former police officers who had worked with both defendants. 3 retired cops took the stand to describe a culture of racism within the department and specific incidents where they had witnessed Reeves and Thompson targeting black citizens. One former sergeant testified that he had tried to report his concerns about the two officers, but had been told by a supervisor to mind his own business. Expert witnesses explained the legal standards for police conduct and detailed how every action taken by the defendants had violated federal law. A constitutional law professor gave the jury a detailed lesson on the Fourth Amendment protections that had been shattered on that Tuesday morning. The defense's case lasted less than 2 days. Neither defendant took the stand, likely on the advice of their lawyers, who knew their clients would be destroyed under cross-examination. Character witnesses tried to paint the two officers as good men who had made a mistake, but their testimony rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was swift and total, guilty on all counts for both defendants. Officer Reeves was found guilty on 7 federal counts. Officer Thompson was found guilty on 6. They faced a maximum combined sentence of more than 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Family members of other victims wept openly. Judge Williams sat quietly in the front row, showing no emotion but clearly vindicated. The defendants' families looked devastated, finally understanding that their loved ones were going to prison for a very long time. But the criminal conviction was just the beginning of the consequences these officers would face. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. The federal judge, Robert Channing, no relation to the prosecutor, reviewed every piece of evidence and every victim impact statement. He had presided over hundreds of criminal cases, but he said this one stood out for the brazen violation of the Constitution and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendants. Judge Williams was permitted to give a victim impact statement before sentencing. She stood at the podium and spoke directly to the 2 men who could not bring themselves to make eye contact with her. She told them that their actions had not only violated her rights, but had damaged the relationship between law enforcement and the community. She said that their behavior made it harder for good officers to do their jobs and reinforced the worst stereotypes about police racism. She also spoke of the broader impact of their crime. Every Black citizen who heard about this case would wonder if they were safe in their own neighborhoods, in their own homes. Every parent would have to explain to their children why some police officers might see them as a threat simply because of the color of their skin. Her statement lasted 20 minutes and left the courtroom in stunned silence. When she finished, Judge Channing sentenced Officer Reeves to 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Officer Thompson received 12 years. Both would serve their time in a federal facility far from their home state, both as a matter of punishment and for their own safety. Convicted cops do not do well in prison, and everyone in the system knew it. The sentences sent a shockwave through the world of law enforcement. 15 years for a single incident of racial profiling was unprecedented. Legal experts called it a watershed moment that would change how officers thought about their own conduct. Police unions condemned the sentences as excessive, but civil rights organizations praised them as long overdue accountability. The civil lawsuit was settled 3 weeks after the criminal sentencing. The city agreed to pay Judge Williams $12 million, the single largest individual settlement for police misconduct in the state's history. The insurance company that had canceled the city's policy was forced to pay the settlement under their previous policy, then promptly filed its own lawsuit against the city for failing to address known problems. But the money was only part of the comprehensive settlement. Judge Williams negotiated an agreement that required the police department to implement sweeping reforms under federal supervision. Every officer would undergo extensive bias training. The complaint process would be completely overhauled with civilian oversight. Body cameras would be mandatory for all interactions with the public. Most importantly, the settlement created a civilian review board with real power to investigate misconduct and discipline officers. Judge Williams insisted on serving as the board's first chairperson, using her position to ensure that meaningful change occurred. Over the next year, the other victims targeted by Reeves and Thompson filed their own lawsuits. The city paid out another $38 million in settlements. The financial strain forced massive budget cuts and led to the resignations of the mayor, the police chief, and 3 city council members who had ignored the warning signs for years. Officer Reeves began his sentence in a federal facility in another state. Within his first month, he was attacked by inmates who recognized him from the news reports. He spent the rest of his sentence in protective custody, basically 15 years in solitary confinement. His wife divorced him 6 months later and moved with their children to the other side of the country. Officer Thompson's experience was similar: 12 years of isolation, a broken family, and the knowledge that his racism had cost him everything. Both men would be released as convicted felons, unemployable and disgraced. The police department they left behind was unrecognizable. Federal oversight meant that every policy, every procedure, and every new hire had to be approved by a Department of Justice monitor. The culture of protecting bad cops was replaced by strict accountability measures. Complaint investigations were conducted by independent civilian investigators, not by fellow officers. Training programs were completely redesigned with input from civil rights organizations and community groups. Officers were taught not only the Constitution but also implicit bias, the escalation techniques, and community policing strategies. The goal was to fundamentally change how officers saw their role in the community. The changes were not universally popular within the department. Veteran officers complained about the increased scrutiny and paperwork. Some opted for early retirement rather than adapt to the new standards. But as the department's reputation began to recover, recruiting improved dramatically, with a more diverse pool of candidates applying to join the reformed force. Judge Williams continued to serve on the federal bench, but her experience changed how she viewed the cases that came before her court. She became known for asking pointed questions in police misconduct cases and for ensuring that constitutional violations had real consequences. 3 years after the incident in her home, she was invited to speak at the FBI Academy about police accountability. Her message to the new agents was simple and powerful. The law applies to everyone, and those who swear an oath to uphold it must be held to the highest standard when they break it. The case became a landmark in civil rights law, studied in law schools and police academies as an example of racism meeting accountability. The security footage from Judge Williams's home was used in training programs across the country to show officers exactly what constitutional violations look like and what consequences they carry. But perhaps the most important impact was on the community itself. Residents who had suffered in silence for years now knew that their complaints would be taken seriously. The Civilian Review Board that Judge Williams helped create investigated every allegation thoroughly and published detailed reports of their findings. The message was clear: racial profiling would not be tolerated, no matter who the target was, and no matter who the perpetrator was. Justice had finally come to a community that had waited far too long for accountability. 2 police officers thought they could intimidate someone they saw as powerless, a person who wouldn't fight back or be in a position to hold them accountable. They could not have been more wrong. Judge Patricia Williams proved that actions have consequences, that evidence matters, and that not even a federal judge is immune to the prejudices that plague our justice system. Her courage to fight back didn't just destroy 2 careers and send 2 men to prison for 15 years. It transformed an entire police department and sent a message that echoed across the country. Sometimes justice is slow. Sometimes it's uncertain. But when brave people stand up and fight for it, it can be absolutely devastating to those who believe they are untouchable. This case was intense, but the one on the right is even crazier.